If you've ever seen someone leave a real estate seminar fired up, convinced they're about to change their life, and then 6 months later they still haven't done a second deal, this video is for you. Because the first deal is not the real test. The second deal is. And that's exactly where most people get exposed. We've all seen it happen. Somebody is emotionally sold on the idea of financial freedom. They show up, they take notes, they hear stories, they buy into the vision. Maybe they even manage to do one deal. But then something strange happens. Momentum disappears. Confidence drops. And instead of building a real business, they end up chasing another event, another tactic, another list, another coach, another script, another strategy. That's not a deal business. That's dependency. And if nobody explains this early, people mistake activity for progress. I'm still inside this world, and one of the biggest patterns I keep seeing is that the seminar industry is very good at getting people emotionally committed to a first breakthrough, but not always structurally prepared for the second one. That difference matters more than most people realize, because the first deal can happen from excitement. The second deal only happens from process. The first deal can happen because you were highly motivated for a few weeks. The second deal only happens when there's an actual machine underneath your effort. And that's where most people run into the wall. They were taught how to get inspired. They weren't taught how to become repeatable. Let's break down why. The first reason most seminar students never get a second deal is because they were sold a moment instead of a model. A moment feels amazing. A room full of energy, a strong speaker, big checks on a stage, case studies, testimonials, urgency, and possibility. That kind of environment can absolutely create belief. But belief isn't a pipeline. Belief isn't a buyer list. Belief isn't consistent lead flow. Belief isn't knowing how to evaluate a deal without talking yourself into something bad. Belief is useful. It matters. But belief by itself doesn't compound. And that's where people get hurt. Because they think the emotional high means the business has started. It hasn't. The business starts when you can sit down on a random Tuesday with no event, no hype, no outside push, and still know exactly what to do next. That's when it becomes real. The second reason people never get a second deal is because they confuse information with execution. This is one of the biggest traps in the entire education space. People leave thinking, I learned so much, and maybe they did. But information feels productive even when nothing has changed. You can watch videos, attend trainings, take notes, download documents, highlight PDFs, join groups, listen to success stories, and still not build a single repeatable system. That's the trap. Because learning creates the feeling of motion, but the market only pays for execution. And execution is a lot less glamorous. Execution is building a buyer list before you need it. Execution is making offers consistently. Execution is tracking conversations. Execution is following up when you don't feel like it. And last, execution is understanding why a deal worked, why a lead died, why a buyer passed, why a seller stalled, and why your numbers were off. That's where second deals come from. Not from knowing more. From doing more of the right things more consistently with more clarity. The third reason people stall after the first deal is because they were taught tactics without enough decision making. This is where a lot of new investors get trapped. They hear about wholesaling, creative finance, rehabs, rentals, tax liens, notes, commercial, seller terms, substituted strategies, market shifts. And instead of building judgment, they just collect options. And that sounds smart on paper, but in practice, too many options make inexperienced people slower. Because now every lead becomes confusing, every deal becomes a debate, every situation becomes a rabbit hole. And instead of getting better at the basics, they become amateur collectors of strategies. That's why some people can sit around learning real estate for years and still not build anything meaningful. They don't have a strategy problem. They have a clarity problem. The people who get second deals usually get simpler, not more complicated. They know what they're looking for. They know what a good lead looks like. They know what kind of deal they want. They know what kind of deal they don't want. And that clarity protects them from wasting loss pretending that they're being strategic when they're just being distracted. The fourth reason is that many people are taught to chase the deal, but not build the environment that produces deals. That's a huge difference. A lot of beginners think that a business is finding a deal. It isn't. The business is building the conditions where deals become more likely. That means relationships. That means conversations. That means pattern recognition. That means understanding who actually buys, who only talks, who is serious, who is emotional, who is stuck, who is ready, who is just curious. The first deal often feels magical because it's new. The second deal usually comes from realizing that it was never magic. It was impulse. And once you see that, you stop acting like deals appear out of thin air. You start acting like an operator. You start asking better questions. Where are my leads really coming from? What am I repeating each week? What part of this process actually creates movement? Where am I relying on motivation instead of structure? What am I doing that looks like work but doesn't create outcomes? Those are business building questions. And those questions are usually missing when people are still under the spell of the first breakthrough story. The fifth reason people never get a second deal is because nobody forces them to study the machine behind the result. This one matters a lot. When most people get their first deal, they celebrate the money. That's natural. But the investors who actually grow study the anatomy of the win. They ask, what lead source produced this? What conversation moved it forward? Why did this seller say yes? Why did this buyer trust me? What numbers mattered the most? What nearly killed the deal? What part was skill? What part was luck? What would I need to repeat this without guessing? That is how the first deal becomes useful. Otherwise, it's just a memory. And a lot of people are walking around with one successful transaction, with no repeatable framework underneath it. That's why they stay stuck. Not because they can't do real estate, but because they never reverse engineered their own result. Now here's the part nobody likes hearing. A lot of people don't actually want a business. They want a feeling that comes with the idea of one. That's different. A business requires repetition. A business requires standards. A business requires boring consistency. A business requires saying no to distractions that feel exciting. A business requires being honest when the thing you're calling research is really avoidance. That's why the second deal is such a powerful test, because it forces the truth out. Was the first deal the beginning of a system? Or was it just a temporary emotional spike wrapped around a one-time outcome? That's the real question. And once you see it that way, you stop being impressed by seminar theatrics alone. You start looking for structure. You start looking for process. You start looking for an actual business mechanics. That shift changes everything. Because the goal was never to become someone who knows how real estate sounds. The goal is to become someone who understands how deals actually work, how they're found, how they're structured, how investors think, how risk is evaluated, how momentum is maintained, how deal flow becomes repeatable instead of random. That's the difference between spectators and operators. And that's also why so many people stay trapped in the seminar loop. They keep going back for another dose of certainty instead of building the skills that create certainty. They keep searching for the room, the mentor, the tactic, the event, the trend, the shortcut. But what they really need is better foundations, better frameworks, better decision-making, better repetition. That's how second deals happen. Not by becoming more emotionally charged, by becoming more operationally clear. So if you've ever wondered why somebody can spend thousands on training, do one deal, and still end up right back where they started, that's why. Because the first deal can be sold, the second deal has to be built. And once you understand that, you start looking at the entire seminar industry differently. You stop asking, did they get people excited? and you start asking, did they actually help people become repeatable? That's a much harder question, and it's the one more people should be asking. If you want to understand the strategies, the frameworks, the mechanics behind the kinds of deals that similar companies talk about, without paying high ticket prices for the packaging, click the link in the description and check out the vault. That's where I break down how these deals actually work, how investors think through them, and how to build a real understanding before you get sold another emotional moment. Because if you're gonna do this, you need more than inspiration. You need something you can repeat.